Our lesson this morning will be from Nehemiah 1 and 2. So you can sort of kind of start looking it up. Nehemiah 1 and 2. If you're looking at your little devotional book, there's a mistake on page 18. So I'll point that out. And if somebody needs one of the devotional books, I can get some. Okay. Again, we're going to look at Nehemiah 1 and 2. Just to point out that there's a misprint on page 18. It's not King Cyrus, it's King Artaxerxes that we're dealing with. A prayer request for this group. Keep Bruce in mind with his health. Are there others that we should think about? There were some mentioned in the announcements earlier. David, will you lead us in prayer?
Sure. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this time to be together, to work into your word. Thank you for granting us revelation, how the word is going to bring to us from your word. We pray for Bruce, we pray for Eddie, we pray for all those in sickness, we pray for your healing, we pray for those around them, comfort, giving help as they're trying to get back to full health. Be with our minds today, help us to study and understand your words and what it means to us today.
The outline that was given, God places his people in positions to meet needs. Believers should respond to the needs with compassion and action. For believers, leading is serving. And I think I probably missed all of those in looking at the lesson. So, but that's the outline that we were given. Let's talk about where we are. Nehemiah is a companion to the book of Ezra. And last week, Roger mentioned some passages from Ezra when he was looking at his lesson. Both deal with the restoration, both books, Ezra and Nehemiah, deal with the restoration of God's people, the descendants of Abraham, to their homeland. Ezra deals with the rebuilding of the spiritual walls of the nation. Nehemiah deals with the rebuilding of the physical walls, the political and the military walls of the nation. So they relate. They're somewhat contemporary and somewhat overlapping. Ezra reports the first return led by Zerubbabel or Shashbazzar. Now, there's a question as to whether those two are the same or if they're different ones, different people. The first return comes under Cyrus the First in about BC 538. The temple is completed in 516 BC. After that, there is a second return led by Ezra in 458 BC. This is under Darius the First, 522 to 486 BC. Then you have Xerxes the First, 486 to 465 BC. That's the Esther story. Now we're at a king named Artaxerxes the First, who is the son of Xerxes the First, 465 to 425 BC. He's also got a nickname, Long Manus, or Long Hand, because his right hand was longer than his left hand. So Nehemiah leads this third group at 445 to 444 BC, which is in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. Ezra expedition back to the Promised Land was in the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign. So that probably bored you, but that kind of sets the things together as to where we are. Let's go back even further. So 605, Daniel is taken to Babylon, Daniel and his friends. 597, Ezekiel and others are taken to Babylon. 585, Jerusalem is destroyed. The people have been back in the land for at least 90 years. Okay? The people at this point have been back in the land for at least 90 years. The city walls are in the same shape that they were in when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed them. Now, there's a question as to whether in Ezra 4 that there was some extensive repair work done, and then because of the decree, that repair work was torn down. It's not really clear, but most of it seems to be from the remainder of Babylon's destruction of the Jerusalem walls. Okay, that kind of jumped ahead of the story a little bit because Nehemiah is a very important person to King Artaxerxes. He is his cupbearer. And that's a little more than just pouring the wine in the cup and giving it to the king. The cupbearer had the role of tasting the food and the wine before giving it to the king to see if it was poisoned. Now, if you can corrupt the cupbearer, the king is in danger. An assassination would be easily carried out that way. Not only does he do this role, but he is sometimes the counselor to the king. He sometimes has the signet ring of the king, so that what he says is as important. Well, it's by the authority of the king, but it goes. Sometimes he is the treasurer for the king. So there are major roles that Nehemiah plays for King Artaxerxes. He is the son of Hakaliah. We know nothing about Hakaliah. His name means the Lord comforts. Nehemiah means the Lord comforts. So, and this book that we're looking at is the words of Nehemiah. So we presume that maybe he wrote these, or maybe Ezra wrote them, or the chronicler wrote them. But they're based on the memories of Nehemiah. So when the book opens, it's in the month of Kislev, which is mid-November to mid-December, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. He's in the citadel of Susa. It's the winter palace of the Persian kings. It's about 250 miles east of Babylon. Hananiah, who's referred to as brother, and it seems to be that he is the actual brother of Nehemiah instead of a relative, and some others have returned from Judea. Nehemiah asks a question. And it's basically, how's it going for the people there? And I find his wording of the question kind of interesting. He says, I asked them about the Jews that have survived, those who escaped the captivity and about Jerusalem. Those that escaped is the part that I find interesting. They were looking at that as that they actually escaped the captivity. The answer is the situation is not good. The remnant are in trouble. They're in distress. They're in shame. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down. And again, we already talked about a little bit about Ezra 4 and some commentators suggesting that this refers to actions taken in Ezra 4 verses 4 through 24 and not to the Babylonian destruction. I think it's probably more likely that it's the Babylonian destruction than what happened in Ezra 4. But notice there's something in Ezra 4:21 that's going to play a role in Nehemiah's presentation of what he's going to request in chapter 2. So he hears this, and his reaction is that he sat down, he wept, he mourned, he fasted, he prayed. Notice that he appealed to God first to deal with the situation. He appealed to God instead of going directly to the king at first. And a side note here is that throughout this book, Nehemiah is seen as a man of prayer. He's seen as a man of prayer. He prays about the situation. He offers himself to God to be a solution to the problem. He prays when he faces opposition in this book. So he prays immediately before asking the king what he should, for his favor. And he prays about his leadership role. So to begin with, Nehemiah is the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. At the end of chapter 1, he is praying about the situation. Notice in his prayer some things that he did in this prayer. It's a prayer of invocation, adoration of God to begin with. He notes who he's speaking with. Yahweh, the Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love. So he adores God. The next thing he does in this prayer is he confesses the sins. He confesses the sins of the nation. He confesses the sins of his family. He confesses his own sins. And then he prays for the people to remember them. And he concludes with the prayer of success. Notice that this prayer is full of scriptures, especially scriptures from Deuteronomy 5, 10, 7, and 9, as a God who loves, a God who keeps his covenant. That includes the exile, which was part of the covenant, from Leviticus 26, 27 through 45, and Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 10. Again, he offers himself as a solution and asks for success in this matter. So that's chapter 1. Questions, answers, observations that you want to make about that first chapter, or even the history that went before. Notice that his prayer relies on the promises that God made and the covenant keeping God. So from there, we move into chapter 2. It's 4 months later. It's 4 months later, still the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. Proverbs 21, verse 1. It's kind of an interesting verse. What's that say? Proverbs 21, verse 1. Yes. So now, with that being pointed out, we see this working out here. Is this always true? And, you may answer it one way and I may answer it another. But that's for another discussion. But God was involved in this decision. Notice that Nehemiah, how much time has passed? 4 months. Was he waiting for the right time to bring this up? Was God preparing Nehemiah for the right time to bring this up? Or both?
4 months of warning.
Yeah, 4 months of mourning, 4 months of praying, seeking God, at times fasting. So there has been some sort of royal function, and Nehemiah has served the wine to the king. The queen is with him. We don't know if this is his wife or his mother. But the queen is said to be with him. And when Artaxerxes observes Nehemiah, he sees that Nehemiah is sad. Now, immediately when he notices this and he mentions it, Nehemiah is afraid. And there's reason to be afraid. The Persians seem to have this idea that just to be in the presence of their king was a reason to be joyful. And if you weren't, it probably means you're displeased with the king and you're probably plotting against him. Okay? So the next words out of Artaxerxes' mouth might have been, off with your head. But there seems to be a close relationship between Artaxerxes and his cupbearer. And we talked about that business of counselor, keeper of the signet ring, treasurer, the one who protects him. So Nehemiah acts with respect and he explains what is going on. Now, I find it interesting that he doesn't mention the city when he's explaining that the walls of the city where his ancestors are buried. And that might be related to Ezra 4:7-23, where Artaxerxes put a stop to rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So maybe at this point he leaves that detail out, or he doesn't emphasize that detail, so he won't remember that in time past he said, stop it. The ancestor's grave, the respect of the ancestors was important among the Persians, and the Persians as a whole did not bury their dead. They exposed them so that the animals would eat them. But they did honor the ancestors by various rituals for the souls of the dead, and special festivals for the dead. Now, the kings, especially the Archaean kings, were buried. They weren't exposed. So, speaking to this king who is in that lineage, that may have played an important role. The gates were destroyed by fire. And at this point, Artaxerxes says, basically, what do you want me to do? So Nehemiah asked for assistance in rebuilding the temple. Now, notice that there is a plan here. Nehemiah has already thought a lot of this out. He has planned for doing this. The king wants to know how long you will be away. Now, there's a question here that comes up. Did he rebuild the wall, which we know later takes 52 days to rebuild? It probably takes about 4 months to go from Susa to Jerusalem. Okay? Journey of about 1,000 miles, give or take. And then, after being there for 52 days to rebuild the wall, does he go back to Susa? I don't know the answer to that. But he gave a time frame. We know that 12 years later, he returns again. He was appointed as governor of this district. Okay. So, did he leave for 12 years, or did he leave long enough to build the walls, come back, and then was sent back for the 12-year governorship, and then return to Persia, and then later go back again? I'm not clear on those things. So he deals with the time of absence. He wants letters to the officials for safe passage. And he wants a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the forest, for timbers. And finally, he gets an escort to take him to Jerusalem. Okay, verse 10 of chapter 2, the first signs of opposition. We have the names of Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard this, and they were greatly displeased that someone had come to seek the welfare of Israel. In the last part of the chapter, there will be another person that is not pleased. Geshem the Arab. That's in verse 19. These people are not pleased that Nehemiah has come to assist the Jews. So, after he arrives, he waits 3 days And then he goes and makes a night inspection of the city wall. Um, right.
People out, are we looking for? So I wonder if like you go back to that relationship, it's like he didn't answer that. If King's with me on this,
Yeah.
those back, I think it's, yeah, that's speculation.
Yeah. The king is with this matter at this point. Now, some years earlier, in the early part of his reign, he wrote a letter that said, stop it. This time he is with it. Another observation that's kind of along these lines, and it relates to the book of Ezra. Ezra refused the escort of the military. Nehemiah accepted it. Yeah. And with the military with him and the letters from the king, he has safe passage to Jerusalem, Judea. There's people that were opposed to this mission. And like I said, verse 10 and verse uh, 19 point out people that were not pleased. And these were government officials that were not pleased. Sanballat was the governor of Samaria. And forgive me, I'm probably not getting those terms right for the role that he played. He was over that area. Most of the gates and locations are presumed to be covered over by Herod's platform today. We can't archaeologically say, this is how Nehemiah did this. But we have some ideas that are kind of, we kind of know some things. The valley is probably the Kidron Valley. The King's Pool, possibly the Pool of Siloam. The Dung Gate opens to the Valley of Hinnom. So that's where they take garbage out. So some of those things. And as Nehemiah was riding along, he comes to a place where, you know, he couldn't ride because of the rubble. So he has kept this under wraps. He hasn't told anybody what he's going to do. He hasn't told the Jews what he is going to do. He hasn't told the priest. He hasn't told the Levites. He has kept this as much under wraps as he possibly can. And the reason is verses 9 and 19. There are those who are opposed to it. And there are those within the Jewish community that had relationships with these people. And therefore, you speak, word gets out, it gets shared. So he's kept it under wraps till he knows the situation in detail. Now, there's other parts of the wall that he probably had already seen as he arrived in Jerusalem, and other parts that he saw just being there for those 3 days. So this is another part that he looked at. So he reveals his plan to the people. And he says he has the favor of God, and he reports the words of the king. But notice that in the opposition, the ridicule that starts coming, one of the accusations is you are rebelling against the king. You are rebelling against the king. So, I mean, that's pretty much what we've got in the story. What are some observations that you can make about the story? And I hope you guys have got some ideas that you can share. Right. So, as Angela has pointed out, this is the way that God is going to bring the promise in, the promise to Abraham, the promise to the whole world. What about Nehemiah? He wasn't a religious leader per se. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a Levite. He had a job. And I'm not going to say he had an ordinary job, because this wasn't an ordinary job, right? This was a very important job. Nehemiah sought direction from God before he sought direction from the king. Yeah, right. I'm glad you pointed that out, because I didn't mention that about chapter 2. Just before, he said, give me favor in this man's life.
There's a lot of preparation. Years. Then it seemed like his darkest days during that 4 months of planning. In preparation, like if people went the first day, they're ready to spend time together. So it was all the difference.
Yeah. Right. That's yeah, that's the point. He sought direction from God. He prayed and fasted and mourned. God brought it, and he planned. I like that, David. So notice that he claims the promises of God, and we should claim the promises of God for ourselves. Not more than what God promises, but not less than what God promises. And we should be willing to do the work of God. And probably we should think long and hard about praying about the work of God if we're not willing to be involved. And the last point, be prepared for opposition. if it's the work of God. Okay, that's all I've got.